All right, hello everybody. So today we're going to be talking about stopping hackers with WaiFu.msc, also known as WF.msc, aka the Windows Firewall. So before we get started talking about that, I would like if all of you guys can go to h5.devsec.club and then just boot up all of the VMs on the VM that should have been pushed out. And the only box you'll need to sign into is going to be the WaiFu box. It should auto sign in. If it does not auto sign in, the password should just be capital P, password, one bang. And then before we get right into talking about Windows Firewall in general, I just want to do a quick little recap of what we went over last week about just general firewall rules. So the first thing is network-based firewalls. And when we think network-based firewalls, we think of like separate hardware that runs its own operating system or its own software, not operating system. And those can generally offer better protection than the host-based stuff, but they're generally harder to get stricter, and they're more complicated in general. Now, the host-based firewall, which is what Windows Firewall is part of the OS, right? You can disable it, but it's always going to come packaged with, say, Windows. And what these are great at compared to network firewalls is that since they're already behind the router, if an attacker gets through and tries to start pivoting, you can try to firewall them off from each other because they'll never pass through your network over firewall. So that's what they're really, really good at doing. And in general, they're simpler to use, so it's easy to get to those stricter standards to try to protect your network more. And then when we think about firewalls too, there's another thing we have to think about. It's stateless versus stateful. So stateless doesn't track connections while stateful does. So what that means is if I try to make a request to a server, then when it tries to reply to me, if it's stateless, I will have to add a second rule to allow that reply back into the system. If it's stateful, the request to them will then be re-allowed in because we have already made that request to them for the outbound rule, so we will actually not need an inbound rule. So we don't have to worry about that. So in general, stateless needs both inbound, outbound, or stateful might not need inbound, outbound. There's a couple catches where services are different ports, but we'll get to that. So that comes to knowing your services, right? So if I'm going to write a firewall rule, first I need to know what kind of protocol it runs and can it run multiple protocols, right? So let's take Firefox, for example. Firefox can run both on TCP and on UDP. So we'll have to make rules for both of those protocols. And then after we decided what kind of protocol it runs, we then have to ask ourselves, does it run on specific ports? So here for FTP, we're going to have a rule for port 20 and a rule for port 21. So now that we know all that general stuff, we can actually start talking about the Windows Firewall itself. So a lot of us are probably common with this little image on the right here, which is basically saying, do you want to allow this program through the firewall? So what that's really doing is basically saying this executable gets to write whatever rules it wants to the firewall. So here down here, if we allow Firefox through, it'll create two new rules in our inbound rules, and they can be whatever they want. Now, in general, it'll only write for the executable, and I believe it only has privileges to write for the executable, but it gets whatever rules it wants, so be careful when you do this because you don't have any control of what's actually happening. In addition, you normally aren't able to modify the exe that it writes. So since it's saying Firefox is there, I can't change that. So that brings us now to the Windows default rules. And when we talk about default rules, what they're good for is, say you go into a new environment, sometimes it's better to just start from scratch, right? Just nuke the firewall, get to a state that you know what's happening. Now, the concern for the most part is that most of the default rules are not good. You can delete about 90% of them and not have to worry about what's happening for the most part, unless it's already been set up in a certain way. The only rules that you have to be a little careful with are the core networking rules. These are stuff like ICMP and just general how the internet works kind of rules. So if you start disabling those, you might just break your internet access and then no one's really happy with you and then you get called for breaking the Windows firewall. The resource right here gives a general overview of some of the default rules. It'll let you know if you can or can't delete them. In general, try to get a basic knowledge of what the rules are. And again, there's not too many. There's about like 50-ish, so it's not too much. And normally they're grouped. So you can normally just start deleting a lot of them once you know what they are. One thing to note though too is that say you're on a server, if you install a new server role or feature, Microsoft will by default add rules to try to allow that application through. Now, there's some more issues with this because first off, the naming convention is not what you always think it's going to be. So on our systems, I have IIS for FTP and web server. Well, the web server rules do not have IIS anywhere in the name. It is World Wide Web HTTP, which at first glance to me is not very intuitive. You just have to know. And another thing too is you're trusting Microsoft to get their default rules right, or to see if the rules are even needed. We'll touch on that. Now, the most fun default rule that they do not tell you is there is that there is an implicit allow for the loopback address. So what that means is even if I have block, say HTTP on your system, if you go from your host to your own server on your host, you can still access it. And for what I know, there is no way of turning this off. You can block every single connection, both inbound and outbound, and this connection will still go through. So now when they have a basic underlining knowledge, we're going to go ahead and add our first rule. So we're going to use the built-in wizard. The only downside of using the wizard is that you can't group stuff, and groups don't have anything. It's just when you're browsing through it, you can just organize by group, so it's just filtering stuff. It doesn't really have any impact. If you're going to try to do group stuff, this rule down here, so I get the net firewall rule. Any display name of Firefox, so I made a new rule. Anything that starts with Firefox will be matched. And then for each of them, assign the group role of firewall so I can filter off that, and then it'll set it. If you want to get more comfortable using some of the PowerShell stuff, this resource right here, Net Security, will show you some of the stuff to just access these PowerShell commands and just a general overview. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to head over to our VM real quick, and we're going to make some FTP rules. So as we learned from the title slide, if we want to get to Windows Defender Firewall, we're going to do our run command, and then do WF.msc, and this will bring up the firewall rules. So once this pops up, I have done a little bit of configuring already for us, so it should be nicer to read. The first thing I did was I changed the private profile, which I'll go over in a sec, but for now what we're going to do, we're going to go with our inbound rules, and you should only see 4. If there's more than this, we'll have to fix it. I'll show you how to fix it in a sec, so don't worry about that. But for now, we're going to go to action. We're going to do new rule. So now it'll pop up this cute little wizard, and we have a couple options here. We can say filter the rule based off program, filter the rule based off ports, predefined. So predefined are those like default rules that Windows already knows about, so you can re-add them back if you delete them and want them back. Or we can do custom rule. So what custom rule does is it lets us do by port and program in the first setup, and it also adds a couple other things. So for this one, we're going to go ahead and do a custom rule. So I'm going to go ahead and do next. So when I talked about knowing your services, I said you got to know protocol and you got to know port. Well, if you want to scope it a little bit harder, you could also know what executable is actually running. So we're going to do FTP rule. Normally you'll run something like FileZilla or something like that, but Windows also comes with a built-in FTP server. So when I'm using Windows built-in rules, the program paths are a little more complicated than normal, say like Firefox would just be like in C program files and stuff like that. The FTP program file is going to be %windir %/system32 and then svchost.exe. So again, this is just stuff that you just start to know and you'll learn. And what you can do to figure out these executable paths is if you install the service through Server Manager, it'll create these default rules for you. So all you have to do is grab the executable path and then rewrite the rule to your tailoring if you want to add it back in. So I'll go ahead and say only for this service or this program, I'll go next. It's going to give you a warning because it's basically saying, hey, you're using Windows executables, be a little careful with what you're doing, right? Because if you start modifying SVC host permissions, it might get a little mad at you for doing that kind of thing. We're just going to ignore that and just click yes. So now we have to say, okay, what protocol does FTP run on? Well, I know that it's a TCP just from knowledge. Again, you'll just have to look these up to know what the protocols are actually running. And then we'll have to figure out what the port is. So I can specify specific ports, or I can just say all ports. Well, I don't want to allow this SVC host to do whatever it wants, so I'm going to give it a specific port. So FTP is going to need both an inbound and an outbound rule, just because of its port numbering. So for the inbound rule, we're going to need port 21. And then remote ports, we don't care. This is basically saying, do I know what my remote host is trying to connect to me with? In this case, we have no idea, or at least we shouldn't know, so we're just not going to touch with that. because it's to be one of the ephemeral ports, so we can't really match on it. We could say like greater than like a certain number, but for this case, we don't really care. So scoping is yet another level of hardening that we can use, and this is to say, do I want specific IPs to be connected to or specific IPs to be able to connect to me? So for a local IP address, it's basically saying I can list this server's IP, which is really no need to do, right? Because it's already trying to connect to me in general. But the remote IP saying is, so say I have like a local subnet, I could list down a local subnet and just list those IPs. That way any host outside of the network firewall or outside of that subnet could not touch me, or at least theoretically should not be able to touch me through the firewall rules. Again, we only have 2 devices on the network, so there's no real need to really do that, so we're just gonna leave that blank. So the next part of the wizard is allow if secure, and block the connection. So allow if secure is a special rule. Basically, it has to do with like IPsec stuff or domain stuff. We don't have that set up, so this isn't going to work. So all we really have to do is allow or block. So if we're trying to allow FTP in, obviously it makes sense we're just going to go ahead and allow it. We're not going to do block. Profile. So I'll go over profiles a little bit later. The profile we are running is a private profile, so we actually don't need to add it to domain or public. We could if we want to, but in this case we're not going to. And then the last step is just to name it. So naming is really nice. Just try to make it a good name. So I'm just going to say FTP inbound, which isn't a great name, isn't a horrible name, but if you're reading through the rule list, if you see FTP inbound, you should know what that rule is trying to accomplish. So now if I go ahead and click finish, it'll kick me out, which I don't know why it does, but it kicks me out. But we'll see that we have a new inbound rule. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you is that we have a little scoring engine up here. So if you open up Firefox and you type in scoring.site, it should pop up this. So here, we added our inbound rule for FTP. Now, we talked about stateless connections, so it's talking to us, right? So that initial connection has been made, so theoretically, the stateful protocol should allow it back out. The only slight issue with FTP is that FTP does not talk out of the same port. So even though it's a stateful connection, it's not trying to return traffic over port 21. So what we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to go back to the firewall and go ahead and add an outbound rule. So here, we're gonna again, go for the wizard again. We'll go a little bit quicker this time because now we should know a little bit what we're doing. Again, program, port, custom, right? You can do either or. We're gonna do custom again. We'll say next. We know the path, so we'll supply it the path. We'll go ahead and do our percent, when_dir, percent, and then we'll do system32, and then we will do svchost.exe, right? So then we'll go next. It's giving the warning because of svc host again. Protocol, still TCP. So now here's the difference. So it's not working because our inbound rule was 21. FTP talks out of port 20. So that's why stateful is not working for the specific protocol. So we'll go ahead and say it's going to be port 20. We'll go to next. Scope, again, we can choose what IPs it goes to. And then we're going to say not. We're going to try to allow the connection. We'll say next. Profile, again, we're on a private profile. I'll talk about these are a little bit. I'll say next, name. And this one, instead of FTP inbound, this is going to be FTP outbound. So if we get all that set up, we should do finish. It's going to kick me out of the firewall. I'll check to see if the firewall is there. I see FTP outbound. I will now check. Eventually, our FTP should get greenlit. Eventually. I think it scans every 10 seconds, so hopefully it should scan. If not, I messed up my rules somehow. I'm going to have to check where I messed them up. Because live demos never work.
You can log in and see what the issue is.
Yeah, I might. It should just work. I didn't mess up my ports, right? Outbound's 20, inbound is 21. Let's go ahead and check. Protocols and ports, TCP on port 20 is good. Okay, inbound rules. Check, FTP inbound. Protocol on 21. We'll go ahead and check to see if FTP is up. These guys are not logged into the network.
That would be it.
Log in.
No, it's not the case.
lowercase.
Capital B box. The rest of us. Waifu. Not Wi-Fi.
I'll fix it in a sec.
Unfortunate.
Well, we'll come back to that. I'm not entirely sure why it's not working, but we're gonna keep checking and we'll fix that in a sec here. But anyways, so that's how we add rules. What we can do too now is, we talked about default settings. You can also just save a known firewall state that you know is good, and you can bring that into a new network. Or if you break something, you can return it to an old state. So what I'm gonna go ahead and do is I'm gonna show you guys what the default rules actually look like and show you what I cleaned up for us just for this lab. So if I go back into the Windows firewall, out here, if we go up a level, so you can either click here, or if you're down a level, you can click this button, it'll bring you all the way up. And then here, if I go to Action, Import Policy, it'll basically say, hey, whatever you import, it's gonna overwrite all your current settings. So I'm gonna go ahead and say, yeah. That's to say, which file do I wanna use? So I have a couple here. So if I pull what my default thing looked like after I install all the services and a couple things like that, I open that, it's going to import, to say import successfully. This light turned green, because I changed that. And I go to inbound rules, and there are all of these default rules. So again, like I said, some of them are disabled already by default, but you really don't need a lot of these rules at all, right? Because as we saw earlier, I had us 4 rules, 2 of them were enabled on inbound, and we had 4 rules on outbound. So you actually do not need a ton of rules to get the network actually up and running, at least these smaller networks. And same with outbound, a lot of them are very similar. Again, just a lot of rules that you don't really need, because Windows just try to bloats everything up. It tries to give you everything you could possibly need all at once, but we don't need all these options, so we can go ahead and clean them up. So now to get back to you guys, I'm going to import another policy. Again, I'm down a level, so I can't import there. So go to Action, Import. To tell me to import, and then I'm just going to restore those rules that I had a second ago that we just wrote. So I'm going to open that up, and then we'll restore the policy that I had a second ago. So if I go back in, it'll have the FTP server rule that we made. This one's just named a little differently because this is like the actual one. And then again, so it has the same rules as port 21, program and services, right? WinDir at System32 SVC host, right? Same for our outbound. We'll go back here. We'll see the FTP traffic out. Again, 20, and then again, port 20, scope, domain change, program and services, SVC host. Hopefully, I'm gonna check if our scoring engine wants to work. Hey, there we go. So I imported some rules that are exactly the same as yours. So hopefully your light has turned green. I'm just gonna pray that it is, because we wrote the exact same thing. I might have had a typo on %WinDir somewhere. I don't think I did, but just we'll move on and hope that it's working for you guys. So continuing on. So now we know how to import and export. The next thing we have to talk about is, okay, we start making all these rules. What rules actually trigger first? So the first priority here is what's called authenticated bypass. So remember that allow connection if secure with the IPsec and domain stuff? That is what authenticated bypass is. So if I go into here, if I go back to my firewall rules, and I click on this rule, there is a way to give it authenticated bypass, which should be, it should have been there. I don't know why it's not appearing. It might be an inbound only rule. If I do this, customize, there it is. Okay, so if you go into the advanced connection and you customize, this little checkbox right here will basically say, okay, set this rule to first priority. So whatever this rule says will trigger before anything else. So there's a block rule, allow rule, anything else, this rule will always trigger first no matter what. So again, I'm just going to cancel out of that, set it back to allow. So that's what authenticated bypass is. The next rule is the block rule. So if there's a block, so if we had a block FTP, it'll then trigger that before the allow. That's just the security thing for Windows. It's basically saying, if you want to block something, odds are if you have an allow rule, it's misconfigured and you probably do actually want to block it. Then it'll do allow connection. And then if it doesn't match any rule, there are default profile behaviors. So what the default profile behaviors are these little red X's or red circles or green check marks. So what you're saying is, for all of my inbound rules, if there are no rules matched, block them. So outbound is if no rules are matched, allow by default. The reason outbound is allowed, not inbound, is that it is much harder to whitelist outbound traffic than it is inbound traffic. So Windows will allow you to basically say, okay, since it's going outbound, I trust it more than stuff going into my computer, so I'll let it out. For this firewall, I just went ahead and said everything that is going outbound is denied. So any rules that are not matched by here will not work. So if anything other than this will not get out of our system, and then anything other than this will not get into our system. So that is what the order matters. And again, this is just a general firewall stuff. It'll tell you about orders and just some other couple things about firewall stuff. So there are a couple rules that I kind of skimmed over. If you were paying close attention to when we were looking closer at the firewall rules when I double clicked on them, there were actually 3 fields that I didn't mention at all: local principals, remote computers, and remote users. So the last 2 cannot be enabled unless that secure connection is allowed. So again, the reason being is I don't know about the remote computer or remote user unless my systems are already joined in some way, which is what a domain does. So basically what I can do here is if I go into my rules, I double click on this, so we see remote computers. So it says only allow connections from these computers, but it gets mad at me because it's saying, hey, you're not domain chained or you're not linked to any other computer, so I can't find any other computer for you. So we can't actually set that rule, save the remote users, right? So let's say I have a domain admin. I only want my domain admin to access this computer, so I can say, okay, only from these users. And again, it gets mad at me because it's saying, oh, I don't know any tunnel that we're already over, so I can't do this. Local principals, though, can be done. So they're just saying local users on this system. So here if I say only allow for connections to, say, the administrator account, it'll do that. Or say only allow FTP connections or RDP connections to the specific user, right? Those will still work because those are local compared to the stuff that is remote. We cannot do those options. So that is what the order for those are doing. Then I've been glossing over what the profiles actually are. So there's 3 firewall profiles for Windows Firewall: domain, private, and public. So domain networks are when you're on a domain, right? If you're on a domain, the network will change to say you're on a network domain. All the rules work for that. Now, private and public, they are actually different networks for the most part. The only difference is that Windows treats them differently. If you tell Windows you're on a public network, it'll scope the rules harder. It will try to let less traffic out and less traffic in. If you tell that it's private, Windows will try to harden the firewall a little bit more and try not to let traffic. It also will not let your device be discoverable on public networks, but it will on private networks, because it's assuming that you're in a semi-safe environment. So if we checked what one we were writing for, I basically told Windows that this is a private profile. So
Actually public. When the VM's deployed, it changed to public.
it changed to public on the VF deploy.
That's where you're.
Oh, that's where the rules aren't working. Oh, so Shane has told me that when the VF deployed, it actually switched our network type.
Might be different. You should check.
Might be different. Let's go ahead and check. So here, if I go to the network stuff, it should tell me what network we are on, and it says we're on an unidentified network.
Try going to network and sharing center instead.
Yeah, let's go there. So we're gonna go here and actually try to set this because apparently we are in a public. Okay, so that is why our rules are not working. So we set all of our rules to be just on the private profile. So what we're gonna have to do to fix this is we're gonna go to inbound rules. We're gonna go to FTP. We're gonna go back to here.
Well, that one started working because you made it all profiles.
Yes. So when I imported stuff. So here, if I do, it should be in general, right? Where is this at again? Well, I can't remember where that rule is. Should be in advanced. There we go. Okay. So what you guys need to do is you guys need to go to your role, go to advanced, and then check mark on public. If you do that for both of your rules, your FTP should be allowed in. So again, to do that, just go to your FTP rule, double click on it, advanced, turn on the policy to public, and then your rule should start working. Also, just because of that, I'm gonna go ahead and go to here. And if I wanna change these default profile stuff, I can go to properties on the right side once I go all the way out. Properties, I can then choose the public, and this outbound connections, I'm gonna block by default. So I'm gonna say block. So now all traffic should be blocked. So now, hopefully, if you go back to scoring.site, your FTP should turn green. So thank you for that, Shane. I did not realize that our network changed when we deployed it. The more you know. Should have checked before we started.
Yeah.
But that's those profiles. So the last thing we really had to start thinking about is securing the firewall. So the first thing I do is remove those permit alls, or as much as you can, right? Try to harden it if you can. Again, sometimes it's too hard, especially in large enterprise environments. If you're trying to whitelist the internet, it doesn't go well. Like you can basically say Firefox, go to any connection you want, and that's pretty much the best you're gonna be able to do, unless you start really strict rules, which is not super easy to do, and normally that's more network level, not host level, so don't worry too much about that. Now, removing unneeded rules is kind of subjective, right? You could argue that some rules are not needed. The one rule that I kept in here, guys, to show you is that when I mentioned that applications get the right rules for whatever they want, is if we go to inbound rules, we'll notice that I disabled both the inbound Firefox connections. So when I allowed Firefox in, it allowed inbound Firefox connections to my device. Now, if we think about how Firefox works, right? Most of the time, Firefox should be originating from our host out to the internet. So there is very little use cases why Firefox should ever initiate a connection to my box, unless I was actually hosting something, which is what the HTTP server is doing for us. So I disabled both of these Firefox rules and made my own outbound rules. Now, the reason we don't need those inbound rules for Firefox, again, is because of the stateful connections. If I have my outbound Firefox rule and then try to connect back in, I do not need inbound because of stateful connections. And then, other than that, check to see if we can scope any rules harder, right? So if I'm just saying allow on port 80, is there a program that can go along with it? Or are there any IPs that I can try to narrow it down? Or can I do the IPsec domain stuff and try to harden even more that way? So what we're going to do now is we're going to try to fix our HTTP server and fix our RDP server. We'll know what's working when our scoring engine turns green. The reason we can't just test it on our own host, again, was because of that implicit allow rule, so we can't just use our own host to test. So, and once we get that set up, you guys are now going to be experts dealing with the WaiFu.msc firewall. So let's move over here and start thinking about what we need to add to make HTTP work and what we need to make RDP work. So first we think is my HTTP going to be an inbound rule or an outbound rule? So we have to think, am I the one hosting the service or am I the one trying to get the service? Well, in this case, I'm the one hosting the service, so it's most likely going to be an inbound rule. So I'm going to go ahead, go to my inbound rules, right? And I'm going to make a new action. I'm going to make a new rule. Now, again, program, I don't expect you to know these. If we were hosting like an actual web server program, then it would be easier to find. But I'll go ahead and give you guys what that is. We'll know the port, so we're going to go ahead and do custom rule because we're going to do program and we're going to do port. So we'll go next. We'll say, okay, what is the program path for HTTP? Now again, we're doing Windows stuff, so it's not super intuitive right off the bat, but this path is simply just system. Again, I don't know why it's that way, it's just the way that Windows decides to do things. So we'll give it the system path. We'll go next. Protocol, again, what kind of protocol is our port going to run? We're going to use TCP, so I'll do 6 for us. And then we'll do the default HTTP again. HTTP can be what other port we want it to be on, as long as both systems know. We'll do the default one, and HTTP runs on port 80. So we got him port 80. We'll go next. Again, scoping, no IPs we want to filter on, so we're going to go ahead and skip that. We'll click next. Action, we want to allow it. Profile, well, we learned that we're actually not on a private profile. We learned that it was now on a public. We can go ahead and push it to all. But we know it's public, I'm just going to push it to public for now. I'll put it to private just to be safe. And then we'll go next. And then here, we can just do HTTP, and we can do inbound. Again, you can be more descriptive, you can add a description, but to me, saying HTTP inbound is specific enough, especially because we're only running one web server, right? If I had 2 servers, let's say like server 1 HTTP inbound or something like that, and then we'll get more. So we'll finish. So now we have to think, okay, we're doing HTTP inbound, do I need an outbound rule? Well, the answer is going to be no, right? Stateful firewall. If a device connects to my system, it's going to make a state that we would not need an outbound rule. So this inbound rule should be enough to turn our light green. We see that our website is green. If we go to our website, we can see, in fact, that our website is being hosted, right? We have our website. Web server is, in fact, up. So we can close that. Now, all we have to fix now is RDP. So RDP, we have to think, is that an inbound or an outbound? Well, remote desktop protocol, they're trying to get to me. I'm not going to do remote desktop protocol out, at least on this system. So we're going to make another inbound rule. We'll go action. We'll do new rule. Again, I know the program because I let the default rules allow when they had ISS installed. If I didn't, I had to Google it around. Port, again, just Google if you don't know. Company known stuff, and then customs because we know both of them. So the path on this one is almost the same as our FTP. The difference now is instead of windir, it is %system root, oops, that is not %, and then it should be system32, and then it is again SVC host. So SVC host gets multiple things. So the question now is this SVC host different than the other SVC host? So the application itself is doing the same thing. The question now is what is spotting it? So there's actually a difference. So I can't just say SVC host for both of them because it's not the same path. It will not allow either of the rules through because it does not match properly. This has to be an exact match to the executable. All right, so we'll do next. Again, I'm using SVC host, a very scary thing to use, so I'm going to go ahead and say yes. Protocol type, again, TCP, and then we know specific port. RDP goes ahead and runs on 3389, so 3389 will work. We'll say next. Scope, again, IP addresses we're not going to deal with. Action, we want to allow this action. We'll say next. Profile, again, we don't need a main. We'll be careful. We'll put it to both public and private because, again, they're pretty similar networks. We might just want to work on both of them in case our host changes networks, right? Because the firewall state maintains no matter where we go. So if I rehook up to the internet, my rules will stay the same. So if I switch to a private network, I need to make sure the rules still match. Name, go ahead and do RDP inbound. I'll say finish. And now, once that gets scrolling, this light should turn green. So that's about all I have for you. If you really want to check if the FTP server is in fact actually up and running, if you know CMD, if you do FTP, and then the IP of the server, which is 192.168.1.10, it'll then ask me, it'll then try to connect. So I'll connect as the administrator account, and then password 1bang. I should connect. And if I dir, there's only one file on it right now. I could get it if I really want it, just to prove the connection is valid. I will get it, and then if I want to leave FTP, I am able to do buy. And then if you want to view the image, it'll just be in the administrator account. Again, you don't have to if you don't want to. And then we see that RDP has been enabled. So just by adding these very few specific rules, we have now enabled 3 services on our system. So again, the firewall rules really aren't that complicated. It's just more of knowing the protocols themselves and knowing what you want the rule to actually do. And then just trying to balance out these orders of the rules. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. So if there's any questions, go ahead and ask now. If not, that's all I have on the Windows firewall. Stream go. Good stream.